All right. We are now getting started with demand. So, this is the beginning of microeconomics. We just finished Introduction to Economics, and now we're starting microeconomics. After Christmas, we'll do macroeconomics, and then next year, we'll be doing the global economy. So let's get started with microeconomics. Now we're getting to the heart of things. What we're going to cover today is part of section 2.1. We're going to cover the big picture, the nature of markets, the law of demand, and the assumptions and the movement along the demand curve. So that's the reading that accompanies the highlights here. We'll start out with the big picture. Before we do that, let's just take a look at the rest of microeconomics for a bit. We are starting out by talking about demand. That is basically what the consumers want to purchase. Then we'll go into section 2.2, which is supply. That's what the producers want to sell. And after that, and only after that, will we put the two together and talk about competitive markets, 2.3. So the big picture with in demand is basically looking at how pricing and demand interact, as well as other factors. So let's start out with the nature of markets. And like a lot of things in economics, the key in this course is you need to understand the terminology. The words that you're used to hearing, like market, have very specific meanings in economics. And so when we're talking about a market, yes, the original term came from going to the fish market or the vegetable market, which still exists. But the market has a much broader meaning than that today. Markets don't have to be a specific place. They could be a market over the internet. Um, the original meaning of markets was talking about mostly where you bought goods. But the word market in economics includes product markets where goods and services are sold. Also, factor markets. We talked about the four factors in the introduction: land, where land sold, where labor sold, where capital sold. Um, again, the market definition is quite broad. The next thing we should talk about is competitive markets, because not all markets are competitive. In fact, we'll talk about monopolies, which are not competitive at all, where there's just one seller later in the course. Um, so, what competitive market is where there's so many buyers and sellers that neither the buyer or the seller has any control over the price. If they price higher, they don't sell anything. So basically, they have no market power. And again, it's important to understand this definition of market power. All right, on to the next section. So now we're talking about the law of demand. All right, the law of demand again starts out with some definitions. Here we're talking about the definition of demand, and demand is talking about consumers who are both willing and able to purchase. You can't just say, hey, I want that. You have to have the financial means and ability to purchase it to be included in the law of demand. The other definition that's very important to understand is ceteris paribus, or all things being equal. That is basically saying the law of demand holds every other factor, and we'll talk about many of these factors that might affect demand equal when it talks about demand. How do economists determine demand? They start out by looking at individual demand. What does one person demand? And they note that as prices go up, for example, a bowl of ramen noodles, people are less interested in buying as many bowls. So they graph one individual's demand for one individual product with the price on the left side and the quantity on the right side. That is the demand schedule for one person. Note that the law of demand explains why that the slope is always downward sloping. This goes back to the previous exercise we did in class on utility and marginal utility, and that as people receive more things, they're less willing to and want to have more of things, along with the fact that as the price goes up, people are less willing to consume as much of something. Market demand is based on individual demand. So market demand takes the quantity demanded by every single individual and it adds it up, and that creates a market demand for a product. I want to point out these exam tips because they'll be very helpful for you. One tip is many students will start drawing diagrams and they won't label what the diagram is. You'll lose points in IB if you don't clearly and fully communicate your knowledge, which means you should label what the chart is and label both sides, not just price, but price of what. In this case, ramen noodles measured in yen, and quantity of what? Ramen noodles measured in bowls per week. You should watch these videos when you're doing the reading. All right, let's go on to the next section. We just finished 2.1.2. Now we're going to talk about the assumptions underlying this law of demand. Again, you'll need to understand and know what the assumptions are to be able to use this very simple model. There are some very significant assumptions about human behavior. And when we get into behavioral economics, some of these assumptions, behavioral economics will go after the fact that some of these assumptions are just too rigid to really talk about humans. Yet in the beginning, the first year of economics, they simplify greatly the discussion of how humans behave economically. So the first assumption is that consumers have clear preferences and it's stable over time. Ceteris paribus, all other things being equal. The second one, that humans are basically all knowing and rational. They have all the information they need to make a decision about pricing. Perfect knowledge. Again, this is a huge assumption, but this assumption holds for most of your 2 years in economics. A little bit when you get into behavioral economics, it doesn't, but that's an assumption that you need to understand when you are making arguments and backing up your claims. The last assumption is that human beings always maximize their personal satisfaction. That's that word utility that we covered in the introduction. The rest of this section talks about other things that affect demand. So now the idea is, okay, let's hold price constant, and change just one other factor. For example, income. And in this assumption, it's basically, hey, as people get more wealthy, they will afford or demand more of a product. The second one is substitution effect, which basically says if one product's price goes up, if there is a strong substitution effect, the demand will shift away from that product. In this case, let's say airlines got more expensive, demand might shift to bullet trains. And then this law of diminishing marginal utility we talked about, which is as people, and we covered in the introduction. Again, these charts should look very familiar. I think we were doing eating pies in the introduction. Now they're talking about pizzas. But again, you can see as the marginal utility is at 0, that means the total utility is starting to go down. In this case, 6 slices of pizza. All right, let's go on to the next section. And this is the last section we'll cover in this reading. Now we're talking about movements along the demand curve and shifts in demand. This is probably one of the biggest definitions that students struggle with in their first semester, which is the difference between quantity demanded and demand. They are not the same thing. Now let's just go through this, right? Quantity demanded is a shift of demand as price changes, right? As price changes, the quantity demand changes along the demand curve. Demand refers to the shift of the demand curve at any given price. For example, we just talked about the income effect, and that as people get wealthier, it tends to shift the entire demand curve to the right. Another example would be when the economy gets worse and people are worried about their jobs, they may stop buying luxury goods or all goods like electric cars in Norway, and that would shift the demand curve to the left.